Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story you think you know. You've read about Ma Ingalls, you've seen her in your mind, that calm, capable woman in a long dress, always patient, always steady, always there. You know her as the mother who kept her family alive on the frontier, who never complained, who made everything work even when nothing should have worked. But tonight, you're not meeting that woman. Tonight, you're meeting the girl who became her. The one who learned that safety is an illusion, that fathers don't always come home, and that survival is something you earn every single day, starting when you're 5 years old, and the world you know disappears in a single night. You're standing in Brookfield, Wisconsin. The year is 1839, and the date is December 12th. The air smells like wood smoke and wet pine, and somewhere in a log cabin that's barely a year old, you're being born. Your name is Caroline Lake Quiner, and you don't know it yet, but you're one of the first white babies born in this territory, in a place that still belongs more to the Ojibwe and Potawatomi than to the settlers who are trying to claim it. Your father is Henry Newcomb Quiner, and when you're old enough to understand what that means, you'll know he's different from other men. He doesn't just farm, he trades. He travels to the Potawatomi villages, learning their language, exchanging goods, building relationships that other white men are too afraid or too arrogant to build. He takes boats across Lake Michigan, carrying lumber and furs and promises, disappearing for weeks at a time while your mother Charlotte waits at home with you and your brothers and sisters, pretending she's not counting the days until he returns. You have older brothers, Joseph and Henry. You have an older sister, Martha Jane. You'll have younger siblings too, Eliza and Thomas, a house that fills with noise and bodies, and the constant work of keeping everyone fed and clothed and warm enough to survive another Wisconsin winter. Your childhood is ordinary in the way frontier childhoods are ordinary, which means it's filled with labour. You're too young to understand is unusual. You learn to card wool when your hands are barely big enough to hold the tools. You learn to churn butter until your arms ache. You learn that children who don't work don't eat, and that eating is never guaranteed, even when you've done everything right. And you learn to watch the lake. Lake Michigan is beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. It stretches to the horizon like an ocean, grey-green and restless, its moods changing faster than you can read them. When your father leaves on his trading trips, you stand at the edge of the water and watch his boat disappear, and something in your chest tightens, a feeling you don't have words for yet. Years later, you'll recognise it as dread. It's November 1845 and you're 5 years old. Your father has been gone for weeks, longer than usual, and your mother's face has changed. She's always been strong, always steady, but now there's something fragile in her eyes, something that cracks a little more each morning when she wakes, and he still hasn't returned. The news arrives on a cold afternoon when the sky is the colour of old iron. A man comes to your door, someone you don't know, and you watch from across the room as he talks to your mother in a voice too low for you to hear. You watch her hands go still on the fabric she's mending. You watch her stand up very slowly, like she's afraid if she moves too fast she'll shatter. Your father's ship went down in a storm. The schooner James K. Polk, a small two-master carrying lumber across Lake Michigan, capsized in violent winds 6 miles north of St. Joseph, Michigan. When another ship found it the next day, it was wrecked but still floating, kept afloat by its cargo of lumber. The lifeboat was gone. The crew was gone. Your father was gone. They found 4 bodies washed ashore near St. Joseph. Your father wasn't one of them. He's somewhere at the bottom of Lake Michigan, in water so cold and deep that his body will never be recovered, never be buried, or never be mourned over a grave where you can leave flowers and pretend he's resting peacefully. You don't understand death yet. Not really. You understand that your father isn't coming home, that your mother cries at night when she thinks you're asleep, that there's suddenly not enough food and your older brothers have to work twice as hard, and your mother's friends from church start bringing baskets of bread and dried meat, their faces full of pity that makes you feel small and ashamed. What you don't understand yet is that this moment is teaching you something you'll carry for the rest of your life. Men leave, and sometimes they don't come back, and the women and children they leave behind have to figure out how to survive anyway. Your mother is Charlotte Quiner now. Yeah, a widow with 6 children and no income in a territory that has no mercy for women in her position. She could remarry quickly, out of desperation, to any man who'd take her and her children. She could send some of you away to live with relatives. She could fall apart. She doesn't. Instead, she does something remarkable. She holds your family together through a combination of pride, stubbornness, and help from unexpected places. The Potawatomi families your father traded with, the ones who knew him as a fair man who kept his word, they don't forget. They bring venison. They bring wild rice. They bring the kind of practical compassion that keeps children from starving when winter presses down like a hand over your mouth. Your mother takes in sewing. She grows vegetables. She accepts help from the church congregation, swallowing her pride because pride doesn't feed children. And slowly, painfully, she keeps you all alive. His name is Frederick Holbrook, and he's a farmer, steady and solid in all the ways your father wasn't. He doesn't travel. He doesn't take risks. He works the same land day after day, year after year, and there's safety in that predictability, even if there's no magic, no adventure, no stories about trading with indigenous peoples or crossing the lake in storms that could kill you. Your family has moved to Concord in Jefferson County, following Holbrook to his farm. You live southwest of another family, the Ingalls family, though you don't know yet that your life will tangle with theirs in ways that will shape everything that comes after. Yeah, you're old enough now to understand what your mother went through when your father died. You're old enough to see the lines around her eyes, the way her hands never stop moving, the way she hoards food like someone who's known hunger intimately. And you're old enough to make yourself a promise. You will never be helpless. You will never be the woman waiting at home, hoping a man returns, with no skills and no options if he doesn't. So you do something unusual for a girl in 1850s Wisconsin. You get an education. Not everyone approves. Education for girls is seen as frivolous at best, dangerous at worst. What does a future wife and mother need with book learning? What good are reading and writing when you'll be managing a household, bearing children, preserving food for winter? Some people whisper that educated women become difficult, that they get ideas above their station, that they forget their place. You don't care. You attend school when most girls your age have already left to work full-time at home. You learn to read fluently, to write in a clear hand, to do mathematics, to speak with confidence. And when you're 16 years old, you do something even more unusual. You become a teacher. The contract is dated October 1858. You'll teach school in Concord for 3 months, and you'll be paid $10 per month, $30 total. It's not much, but it's yours. Money you've earned with your own mind and your own labour. Money that doesn't depend on a husband or a father or anyone else's permission. You stand in front of a classroom full of children, some of them nearly as old as you are, and you teach them to read. You teach them arithmetic. You teach them that knowledge is a kind of power, the kind that can't be taken away by storms or shipwrecks or bad luck. And you feel something you haven't felt since your father died. A sense of control over your own life. The Holbrook farm is near the Lansford Ingalls property, close enough that you see the Ingalls family at church, at community gatherings, at the kind of social events that fill the spaces between planting and harvest. You notice them the way everyone notices families in small communities, cataloguing who they are, where they fit, what they're like. There's a son, Charles Philip Ingalls. Everyone calls him Charles, or Charlie when they're being familiar. He's in his 20s, 9 years older than you, a young man with restless energy and a smile that makes him popular at dances and socials. He's good with his hands, good at hunting, good at the kind of practical skills frontier life demands. He plays the fiddle, and when he does, people stop what they're doing to listen. He notices you. You're not sure when it starts exactly. Maybe it's at a church social, where you're helping serve food and he's charming the older women with stories about hunting deer in the big woods. Maybe it's at a dance, where he plays his fiddle and watches you over the crowd, his eyes following you in a way that makes your skin warm. Maybe it's just the slow accumulation of moments in a small community where young people don't have many options and proximity turns into familiarity, turns into something that feels like affection. He courts you the way young men court young women in 1859 Wisconsin. He walks you home from church. He comes to call at your mother and stepfather's house, sitting in the parlour making polite conversation while your mother watches him with the assessing gaze of a woman who knows what it means to choose wrong. He talks about his plans, about land opening up in the West, about opportunity and independence and building something of his own. You listen, and you hear two things at once. You hear a man who wants to build a future, who wants to provide, who has ambition and energy, and the kind of confidence that makes you believe he can do what he says. But you also hear something else. You hear restlessness. You hear a man who's never satisfied with where he is, who's always looking toward the horizon, who talks about moving west the same way your father talked about crossing the lake, like it's an adventure instead of a risk. You're 19 years old and you've been supporting yourself as a teacher. You could keep teaching. You could stay single, build a reputation, save money, maintain the independence you fought for. You could wait for someone else, someone more settled, someone who wants to plant roots instead of chase horizons. But Charles is handsome. He's charming. He makes you laugh. And when he asks you to marry him, when he promises you a home and stability and a future built together, you want to believe him. So on February 1st, 1860, you stand in Concord, Wisconsin, and you marry Charles Philip Ingalls. You're 20 years old. He's 24. Your witnesses are Peter Ingalls, Charles's brother, and Martha Quiner, your sister. You're wearing your best dress. You're holding Charles's hand. You're making promises about love and honour and staying together until death. And you don't know yet that what you're really promising is to follow him across 4 states, through failure after failure, watching him chase something that never quite exists while you do the actual work of keeping your family alive. You don't know yet that home will become a word that means nothing, a temporary stop between movements, a place you'll learn not to get attached to because attachment only makes leaving hurt more. You don't know yet that you've just married your father's restlessness, that you've chosen the very thing you swore you'd avoid, that the man you're looking at with love is going to spend the next 20 years dragging you toward horizons that retreat faster than you can reach them. All you know right now is that you're married. You're Mrs. Charles Ingalls, and you're about to learn what that really means. It's 1862, and you're standing in Pepin County, Wisconsin, watching your husband and his brother Peter and your brother-in-law Henry Quiner cut logs for a cabin that will be your first real home as a married woman. 2 years have passed since your wedding. 2 years of living with Charles's parents, of sharing space and resources, of learning what it means to be married to a man whose idea of a good plan is to move 7 miles into the forest, away from neighbours, away from town, away from everything resembling civilization. They call this area the Big Woods, and the name isn't poetic, it's literal. The forest here is so dense that sunlight struggles to reach the ground. The trees grow thick and tall, their canopies interlocking overhead, turning midday into twilight even in summer. Game is abundant: deer, bear, wolves, smaller animals you can trap for fur. The Chippewa River runs nearby, full of fish if you know how to catch them. This is opportunity, Charles tells you. This is independence. This is what you've been working toward. What it really is: isolated, remote, dangerously far from help if anything goes wrong. But you're pregnant with your first child, and pregnant women don't get to argue about where they'll give birth. So you watch the men work and you help where you can, and you learn how to turn a clearing in the forest into something resembling a home. The cabin rises slowly, log by log. It's not large. No frontier cabin is, but it's solid. 1 room, a fireplace for heat and cooking, a loft space where children will sleep when they're old enough to climb a ladder. The chinking between the logs is a mixture of mud and moss, stuffed into gaps to keep wind and cold and animals out. The floor is packed dirt, hard as stone in summer, frozen in winter, impossible to keep truly clean. There's no well yet. You'll carry water from the creek, hauling buckets that weigh more than you think you can lift, doing it anyway because water isn't optional. There's no glass for windows. You'll use greased paper, which lets in light but not much else. Certainly not a view of anything beyond vague shapes and shadows. This is the cabin that will eventually appear in your daughter Laura's books as a place of warmth and safety, a cosy refuge where a loving family tells stories and makes maple sugar and dances to Pa's fiddle music. And those things will happen, because you'll make sure they happen. Because creating moments of joy in a harsh place is part of how you'll keep your children's spirits from breaking. But what the books won't tell you, what Laura won't remember or won't admit, is how hard this life is, how much labour it takes just to survive, How many nights you'll lie awake listening to wolves howl close enough to make your breath catch, wondering if the cabin door will hold if something decides to test it. How many times you'll go to bed hungry because there wasn't quite enough food, and you fed your husband and children first, swallowing the emptiness in your belly like it's just another chore to complete. You give birth to Mary Amelia on February 1st, 1865, 5 years to the day after your wedding. She's born in this cabin, with a midwife from a neighbouring family and your mother-in-law's help, because Charles can't do anything useful during labour except pace and worry and stay out of the way. The labour lasts 14 hours. 14 hours of pain that splits you open, pain that makes you understand why women die doing this, why childbirth is one of the leading causes of death for young women, why the graveyards are full of women in their 20s who bled out or got infections or had babies that wouldn't come. But you survive. Mary survives. She's healthy, strong-lunged, with her father's light hair and your mother's steady gaze. You hold her in the dim cabin, exhausted beyond anything you've ever felt, and you feel two things simultaneously: overwhelming love and absolute terror. Because now there's someone who depends entirely on you. Someone who'll starve if you can't feed her, freeze if you can't keep her warm, die if you can't protect her. The responsibility is crushing. 2 years later, Laura Elizabeth is born. February 7th, 1867. Another winter birth. Another labour that feels like it might kill you but doesn't. Another baby girl who looks up at you with eyes that don't know yet how hard this life is going to be. Charles is disappointed, though he tries to hide it. He wanted a son. Sons can help with heavy work, can take over a farm eventually, can carry on a name. Daughters are beloved, yes, but they're also going to leave when they marry, and the investment of raising them goes to someone else's family. You don't care. You look at Mary and Laura, your two daughters, and you see something Charles doesn't. You see resilience. You see the strength they'll need. You see yourself at 5 years old, learning that the world is brutal and unfair and you survive it anyway. Life in the big woods settles into a rhythm governed by seasons. Spring means planting, tapping maple trees for sugar, cleaning the cabin after a winter of being sealed inside. Summer means tending the garden, preserving everything you can, preparing for the winter you know is coming. Fall means harvest, hunting, smoking meat, storing root vegetables in the cellar Charles dug by hand. Winter means survival, rationing food, keeping the fire going, staying alive until spring returns. You do the work that keeps a household running. You cook every meal from scratch, over a fireplace that requires constant tending, using ingredients that are never guaranteed. You make all the family's clothing, mirrored from spinning the wool or weaving the flax to cutting and sewing each garment by hand. You preserve food, salting meat, smoking fish, drying berries, making cheese, churning butter. You bear children and nurse them and teach them and keep them clean and safe and fed. Your work never ends. There's always something that needs doing, always another task waiting, and nobody calls it work. It's just what women do. It's invisible labour, unrecorded and uncompensated, the foundation that makes everything else possible. Charles hunts. He brings home venison and rabbits, and occasionally something larger, a bear once, which feeds the family for weeks and provides fat for cooking and fur for warmth. He plants and harvests wheat, though the crop is always uncertain, always dependent on weather and luck. He trades sometimes, travelling to town to sell furs or wheat, bringing back supplies you can't make yourself: salt, sugar, coffee, fabric. When he's home, he plays his fiddle in the evenings, filling the cabin with music that makes the isolation feel less heavy. You watch Mary and Laura dance, their small bodies twirling in the firelight, and you let yourself believe that this is enough, that this life you're building, hard as it is worth the cost. But Charles is already talking about moving. He's hearing things from his father, from his uncles, from other men at church and town gatherings. There's better land farther west, cheaper land, more opportunity. The Homestead Act has passed, promising 160 acres free to anyone willing to work it for 5 years. Kansas is opening up. Minnesota has good soil. Dakota Territory is the future. Every conversation about moving makes your chest tight. You've just finished making this place livable. You've just gotten Mary and Laura settled. You've just started to build a life that feels almost stable. But you're a wife in 1868, and wives don't get final say. You can express opinions. You can argue carefully, using the right tone so it doesn't sound like defiance. You can remind Charles of his promises, of his daughter's need for stability, of the risk of moving when what you have is working well enough. But ultimately, if Charles decides to go, you'll pack your belongings and follow him, because that's what wives do. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and frustration and bone-deep tiredness, there's a small voice that remembers your father drowning in Lake Michigan. A voice that knows men who take risks sometimes don't come home. A voice that wonders if Charles's restlessness is going to cost you everything. But you push that voice down. You smile. You nod. You keep your hands busy and your worries quiet, and you prepare for whatever comes next. And the next thing that comes isn't a question. It's a decision Charles has already made. It's May 1868, and you're watching him load the wagon with everything you own, which still isn't much after 8 years of marriage. Your dishes, wrapped carefully in quilts you've sewn from scraps. The tools he uses for carpentry and hunting. The fiddle, always the fiddle, tucked in a place where it won't get damaged. And your daughters, Mary at 3 years old and Laura barely 1, you're too young to understand what's happening, but old enough to sense that something big is changing. Charles has sold the Wisconsin land to a Swedish settler named Gustaf Gustafsson for $1,012.50. He won't get all that money at once. It'll come in installments. But he doesn't need to wait for the full amount because he's already decided where you're going and why you need to leave now, before doubt creeps in, before Caroline can say all the things she's thinking but won't say out loud. Kansas. That's the destination. Kansas Territory, where land is opening up, where the government is about to survey the Osage Diminished Reserve and make it available for settlement. Charles has heard the rumours, the whispers carried by other restless men at church and town gatherings. If you get there early and stake your claim, you'll be first in line when the land becomes legal to buy. What he doesn't tell you, what he maybe doesn't even admit to himself, is that the land isn't actually available yet. The Osage people still own it. The treaty selling their reserve to the railroad was signed in 1868, but it hasn't been finalised, hasn't been surveyed, hasn't been opened for legal settlement. The Osage are still negotiating, still trying to save what's left of their homeland after decades of being pushed westward by people exactly like Charles, people who see empty land where others see home. But Charles doesn't think about that. Or if he does, he pushes it down the same way you push down your own fears. Because acknowledging the moral weight of what you're about to do means facing something neither of you is ready to face. So you head west, through Wisconsin, into Iowa, across Missouri, into Kansas Territory. The journey takes weeks, the wagon creaking over roads that aren't really roads, just ruts worn into the prairie by previous travellers. Mary and Laura sleep in the wagon bed at night, their small bodies curled together, while you and Charles lie beneath the wagon on bedrolls, listening to the sounds of the prairie, wind that never stops, coyotes howling in the distance, sometimes the deeper, more unsettling sound of wolves. You arrive in Montgomery County, Kansas, in late summer or early fall of 1869. The land here is beautiful in a way that's completely different from Wisconsin. No dense forest pressing in on all sides. Just prairie, endless rolling prairie, grass that grows so tall it brushes your waist when you walk through it. The sky is bigger here, stretching from horizon to horizon, without trees to break it up, and at night the stars are so bright and numerous they look like someone spilled salt across black velvet. Charles finds a spot near Walnut Creek and starts building another cabin. This one is similar to the Wisconsin cabin, logs chinked with mud, a fireplace, packed dirt floor, but the isolation is different. In Wisconsin, you had neighbours within a few miles. Here, the nearest family is farther away, and the town of Independence, where you'll buy supplies, is a journey that takes planning. The Osage people are still here. You see them sometimes passing through on their way to traditional hunting grounds, moving across land that has been theirs for generations, Charles tells you not to worry, that they're peaceful, that the treaty will go through soon and everything will be legal. But you worry anyway. Because you're a woman alone with 2 small children when Charles goes hunting or travelling to town, and because deep in your bones you know that you're living on land that doesn't belong to you, that hasn't been given to you, that you're taking without permission or right. You're pregnant again. You realise it sometime in the fall, that familiar feeling of nausea in the mornings, the exhaustion that goes bone deep, the way your body is changing to accommodate another life. By winter you're showing, your belly swelling beneath the dresses you've let out as much as they'll go, and by spring you know the baby will come soon. You give birth on August 3rd, 1870. Another girl. You name her Caroline Celestia, Carrie for short, after yourself and Charles's mother. The labour is easier than it was with Mary or Laura, or maybe you've just learned to endure it better, to separate yourself from the pain until it's over and you're holding a new baby and the memory of suffering is already starting to fade. Carrie is born on Osage land, in a cabin that stands on territory that hasn't been legally transferred, making her arrival symbolic in ways you won't understand for years. Another generation of settlers putting down roots in soil that doesn't belong to them. The Osage returned from their winter hunting trip in early 1871, and they're not happy. While they were gone, hundreds of white families have moved onto the reserve, building cabins, ploughing fields, claiming land as if the ownership has already transferred. The tribe protests to the government. They argue that the 1868 treaty was illegal, that they were coerced, that they deserve better terms, and remarkably, for once, the government listens. Not because they care about the Osage, but because the railroad deal has fallen through and the legal situation has become complicated. The government sends soldiers in the spring of 1871 with a clear message. All white settlers on the Osage Diminished Reserve must leave immediately. Charles is furious. You've been here almost 2 years. You've built a cabin, dug a well, planted crops. You've invested labour and hope into this place, and now you're being told it was all for nothing, that you have to pack up and leave behind everything you can't carry. But you can't argue with soldiers, so you do what you've done before and what you'll do again. You pack the wagon. You bundle up 3 daughters now, including baby Carrie, who's barely a year old. You leave behind the cabin and the well and the garden plot. And you head east, back toward Wisconsin, back toward the places you've already been, the life you couldn't make work the first time. Charles doesn't talk much on the journey. His jaw is tight, his hands gripping the reins harder than necessary, his eyes fixed on the horizon like he's trying to see something that isn't there. And you understand, sitting beside him on the wagon seat with Carrie in your arms, that this is going to be your life, moving, always moving, chasing something that retreats faster than you can reach it, leaving behind pieces of yourself at every stop, never staying long enough to call anywhere home. You're back in Minnesota by 1874, but this time it's not Wisconsin. Charles has heard about good land in Walnut Grove, about the Homestead Act opportunities along Plum Creek. This time, he promises, will be different. This time the land is legal, government-sanctioned, truly available. This time you can stay. You want to believe him. More than that, you need to believe him, because the alternative, that you'll spend the rest of your life moving from place to place, that your daughters will never have the stability you've begged for, is too exhausting to contemplate. So you settle along Plum Creek in Redwood County, Minnesota. Charles builds another cabin, though this one is different. A dugout, half house and half cave, dug into the hillside with walls made of earth and sod. It's not beautiful, but it's practical. The earth walls provide insulation, keeping the house cooler in summer and warmer in winter, and it's temporary, Charles assures you, just until you can afford to build a proper frame house. For the first time in years, things seem to work. The land is good. Charles plants wheat, and it grows tall and golden, swaying in the wind like waves on a green ocean. You tend a garden that produces vegetables, potatoes, carrots, turnips, beans. Mary is 9 years old now, old enough to help with chores. Laura is 7, curious and energetic, always underfoot but learning. Carrie is 4, still small but no longer a baby. You let yourself hope. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is the place where you'll finally stop moving, where your daughters can grow up in one location, where you can build something that lasts, and then the sky turns black. It's midsummer 1874, and you're outside hanging laundry when you notice the cloud approaching from the west. At first you think it's a storm, the way the light changes, the way the air suddenly feels different. But storms move differently than this. Storms have a logic to their movement, a pattern you've learned to read after years of watching prairie weather. This moves like something alive. You hear it before you understand what you're seeing, a sound like wind, but not wind, like rain, but not rain. A clicking, crunching, roaring noise that grows louder as the cloud gets closer, until you can see that what looked like a storm cloud is actually insects, grasshoppers, millions of them, billions of them. So many that they blot out the sun and turn midday into twilight. They land on everything, on the roof of the dugout, on the laundry you've just hung, on your skin, in your hair, covering every surface until the world is a moving, clicking mass of insects. And then they start eating. They eat the wheat, every stalk, every grain, gone in hours. They eat your garden vegetables. They eat the leaves off the trees. They eat the wool off the sheep and the leather off the harness and the curtains in your windows. They eat everything, and when there's nothing left to eat, they lay eggs in the soil and fly away, leaving behind devastation so complete it looks like the land has been burned. Charles stands in the field where his wheat used to be, and you watch something break in his face. All that work, all that hope, gone, just gone. And in its place, debt. Because he bought supplies on credit, counting on the wheat harvest to pay it off. Now there's no harvest, which means there's no money, which means the creditors will come calling, and you'll have nothing to give them. Other families are leaving Walnut Grove. The grasshopper plague has broken them financially, emotionally, spiritually. But you stay, partly because you have nowhere else to go, partly because leaving would mean admitting defeat again, partly because you're pregnant, and pregnant women don't have the luxury of giving up. You give birth on November 1st, 1875. A boy this time, finally a son. You name him Charles Frederick, Freddie for short, after his father and his grandfather. Charles is overjoyed in a way he wasn't with the girls, holding his son like he's something precious and fragile, talking about the future like it's suddenly possible again. But Freddie is never quite right. He's weak from the beginning, smaller than your girls were, fussier, harder to feed. You tell yourself he'll grow stronger, that some babies just take longer to thrive. But deep down, beneath the hope you're trying to maintain, the grasshoppers return in 1875. Not as many as before, but enough. Enough to destroy what little Charles managed to replant. Enough to make it clear that staying in Walnut Grove means watching your family starve. Charles's brother Peter lives in Zumbro Falls, in Wabasha County, and he's offered Charles work. Not farming, not homesteading, just work. Mill work, carpentry, whatever pays. It's a step backward, a admission that the frontier dream has failed again. But it's income. Well, an income means survival. So you pack again. In the summer of 1876, with Freddie barely 9 months old and still weak, still struggling, you load the wagon one more time and head to Zumbro Falls. And somewhere on that journey, in the heat and dust and exhaustion, Freddie gets sick. It starts with diarrhea, which isn't unusual for babies, especially in summer heat. But it doesn't stop. He can't keep anything down, can't keep anything in. His small body dehydrates faster than you can rehydrate him. His skin turning papery, his eyes sinking, his cries getting weaker. You try everything. You hold him. You rock him. You pray. You beg God or fate or whatever force controls these things to spare your son, to let him live, to give you this one thing after taking so much else. On August 27th, 1876, Charles Frederick Ingalls dies in your arms, 9 months old, your only son. He dies of diarrhea, one of the most common causes of infant death on the frontier, a thing that kills because you don't have clean water or proper medicine or doctors who know what to do. They bury him on Peter's farm in Zumbro Falls, a small grave for a small boy, in a place you'll never live, on land you don't own. Charles makes a wooden marker, but you know it won't last. Weather will wear it down, the farm will change hands, and eventually no one will remember that a baby named Freddie is buried here. You don't cry at the funeral. You can't. If you start crying, you're afraid you'll never stop, afraid the grief will split you open and everything inside will spill out. So you stand there, dry-eyed and silent, while they put dirt over your son, and you make yourself breathe because your other children need you, and breaking down isn't an option. Laura will never write about Freddie in her books. The gap between On the Banks of Plum Creek and By the Shores of Silver Lake will cover this entire period. The grasshoppers, the move to Iowa, Freddie's birth and death, as if none of it happened. Maybe the memories are too painful. Maybe she doesn't remember him clearly since she was only 8 when he died. Maybe she's protecting you because she knows that some losses don't heal, they just scar over. It's late summer 1876 and Charles has another plan. His brother-in-law William Stedman from Walnut Grove has moved to Burr Oak, Iowa, and bought a hotel called the Masters Hotel. He needs help running it, and he's offered Charles work. Real wages, steady income, the kind of security you haven't had since before you got married. You're still numb from Freddie's death, still moving through your days like you're underwater, doing what needs to be done but not fully present, not fully alive. The decision to move to Iowa isn't really a decision. It's just the next thing that happens, and you don't have the energy to resist. You arrive in Burr Oak in the fall, and the Masters Hotel is not what you expected. It's a substantial building, 3 stories, sitting right in the centre of town, but it's attached to a saloon. Not near a saloon. Attached to it. Connected. The bar is on the main floor, and the sounds and smells and behaviour of drunk men seep through the walls into the living spaces where your daughters sleep. The hotel has a kitchen in the basement, along with a dining room. And that's where your family lives. In a kitchen bedroom below ground level, all 5 of you, Charles, Mary, Laura and Carrie, crammed into one room that smells like cooking grease and damp earth. Your job is to cook for the hotel guests and help manage the household. Charles does carpentry work on the building, helps with various repairs, assists Stedman with whatever needs doing. Mary and Laura help serve meals, carry dishes, do the endless work that hotels require. And you watch drunk men stumble through the building at all hours. You listen to fights break out in the bar. You see things you never wanted your daughters to see. Violence, profanity, the ugliness that alcohol brings out in men who've lost their inhibitions. This is the lowest point. Lower than Kansas, where at least you had your own cabin. Lower than the grasshopper years, where at least you were trying to build something. This is survival without dignity. Working in someone else's building. Living in a basement, raising daughters in an environment that goes against every value you've tried to instill in them. You endure it for months, through fall, through winter, into spring. And then you're pregnant again. The pregnancy is complicated by exhaustion and stress, and the fact that you're living in conditions that aren't sanitary, aren't safe, aren't suitable for bringing a new life into the world. But babies don't wait for better circumstances. They come when they come, whether you're ready or not. Grace Pearl is born on May 23rd, 1877. Another girl, healthy, surprisingly, given everything. Yeah, you hold her in that basement room and you feel 2 things simultaneously. Overwhelming love for this new daughter and absolute desperation to get your family out of this place. So you do something you've never done before. You tell Charles no, not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly, quietly, with the kind of steel in your voice that makes it clear this isn't a request or a suggestion. You tell him you're leaving the hotel work, that you're moving your family out of this place, that your daughters will not grow up serving drunk men and sleeping in a basement and thinking this is normal. Charles doesn't argue. Maybe because he sees how serious you are. Maybe because he's ashamed of how far you've fallen. Maybe because he knows you're right. He finds a small brick house on the edge of town, renting from a man named Benjamin Bisbee. It's not much, but it's yours, separate from the saloon, away from the chaos. You move your family in the summer of 1877, and for a few months things are almost stable. Charles works at a grist mill. You take in sewing, mending clothes for families who have more money than time. Mary helps with Carrie and baby Grace. Laura does household chores. It's hard work, always hard work, but it's honest and it's away from the ugliness of the hotel, and then the rent comes due and you don't have enough money. Charles asks Bisbee for an extension. Just a little more time. He'll send the money, he promises. The same promise he's made to other creditors in other towns, the same promise that's always sincere in the moment and always difficult to keep. Bisbee refuses. He threatens to seize Charles's horses, the team that pulls your wagon, the only way you have to move if you need to. So Charles makes a decision. Not a good decision, not an honourable decision, but a practical one. He wakes the family in the middle of the night. He loads the wagon in darkness. And you leave Burr Oak without paying what you owe, driving away before the sun comes up before anyone can stop you. You don't say anything as Iowa disappears behind you. You just sit on the wagon seat with Grace in your arms and Carrie pressed against your side, and you think about the fact that your husband just made you complicit in theft. Not violent theft, not robbery, but theft nonetheless. You're leaving a debt unpaid, a man who trusted you out of his money, and you're running like criminals. Charles is taking you back to Walnut Grove, back to Minnesota, back to a place you've already failed once, as if returning will somehow change the outcome, and you realise, sitting there in the pre-dawn darkness, that this is who you are now. Not pioneer woman, not frontier mother, not the strong and capable Ma that Laura will write about in her books. You're a woman who moves in the night to avoid creditors, a woman whose husband can't provide stability, a woman who's lost a son and is raising daughters in a life of constant displacement. The shame sits in your chest like a stone, heavy and cold and permanent. But you keep moving, because that's what you do. That's what you've always done. You keep moving, keep working, keep pretending that the next place will be better, that Charles's next plan will work, that someday. Somehow this will all make sense. Behind you the sky is starting to lighten, pink and gold spreading across the horizon. A new day, another beginning, another chance to fail. You hold Grace closer and you keep your eyes forward and you prepare yourself for whatever comes next. Because you're Caroline Ingalls, and if nothing else, you know how to survive. You know how to survive. You've proven it over and over. But what you're about to learn is that there are different kinds of survival, and some of them cost more than you ever imagined paying. You're back in Walnut Grove in late 1877, and you're rebuilding again. Charles finds work doing carpentry, odd jobs, anything that pays. You take in sewing. Mary is 12 now, Laura is 10, Carrie is 7, and Grace is barely walking. The shame of leaving Burr Oak in the night still sits heavy in your chest, but you push it down because dwelling on shame doesn't feed children or pay rent. For a year and a half, you build something that almost looks like stability. It's not the farm you wanted. It's not the homestead dream Charles promised. But it's honest work in a town where people know you, where your daughters can attend school, where you can go to church on Sundays without feeling like you're hiding from creditors. Mary is turning into a young woman, tall and graceful, with her father's light hair and your careful manners. She's an excellent student, top of her class, the kind of daughter teachers praise and neighbours admire. She wants to be a teacher herself someday, like you were before marriage. You encourage her, because education is the one thing no one can take away, the one inheritance that matters more than land or money. Laura is different, wilder, more restless, more like her father. She reads voraciously but resists the domestic skills you're trying to teach her. She'd rather be outside helping Charles with outdoor work, learning things girls aren't supposed to care about. You worry about her sometimes, about whether she'll be able to settle into the life women are supposed to live. It's February 1879, late in the month, when Mary comes to you complaining of a headache. At first you think nothing of it. Children get headaches. You give her willow bark tea, tell her to lie down, expect her to be better by evening. But by evening, the headache has become a fever. And by the next morning the fever is burning so hot you can feel the heat radiating from her skin before you even touch her. You've seen fevers before. You've nursed your children through illnesses, watched them burn and recover, learned to read the signs of danger. But something about this fever feels different. Mary isn't just hot. She's confused, talking in her sleep, saying things that don't make sense, her words tumbling over each other like stones falling down a hill. Charles rides to town for the doctor. You stay with Mary, changing cool cloths on her forehead, spooning water into her mouth when she's conscious enough to swallow, praying with an intensity you haven't felt since Freddie died. The doctor comes. He's a tired man with kind eyes and hands that smell like carbolic acid. He examines Mary, checks her pulse. Wool looks into her eyes with a light that makes her flinch and turn away. He asks questions about when the fever started, whether she's had any other symptoms, whether there are other cases of illness in town. It could be several things, he tells you, his voice careful. Scarlet fever, possibly, or what we sometimes call brain fever, inflammation of the brain and its coverings. Brain fever. The words land in your chest like stones. Will she recover, you ask, and your voice is steady, but underneath it there's fear so sharp it could cut. Most children do, he says, but there can be complications. We'll have to wait and see. Wait and see. Those words again. The same words you've heard before. The same uncertainty, the same helplessness. You can build a house. You can preserve food for winter. You can manage a household with almost no money. But you can't fight whatever is burning through your daughter's brain, destroying her from the inside while you watch. The fever lasts for days. Mary drifts in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing you, sometimes looking at you like you're a stranger. One side of her face droops, the nerves temporarily paralyzed by whatever is ravaging her nervous system. You sit beside her bed, holding her hand, and you make bargains with God. Take anything else, take the house, take the money, take your own health, just let Mary recover. The fever breaks after nearly a week. Mary wakes up weak, confused, soaked in sweat that's drenched the sheets you've changed a dozen times. She's alive, and for a moment you let yourself believe that's enough, that you've been spared the worst. And then Mary says, "Ma, why is it so dark?" Your hand freezes on her forehead. "It's not dark, sweetheart," you say carefully. "It's morning. The sun's been up for hours." "But I can't see it," Mary says, and there's fear in her voice now, rising panic. "Everything's dark. Ma, I can't see." The world tilts sideways. You hear yourself saying calm words, telling Mary not to worry, telling her it's probably temporary, the fever affecting her eyes, it will get better. But underneath the calm words, something inside you is screaming. The doctor comes back. He examines Mary's eyes again, this time spending longer, looking more carefully, his expression getting heavier with each passing moment. Finally, he pulls you and Charles aside into the main room, away from where Mary can hear. "The fever damaged her optic nerves," he explains. "I've seen it before with this type of illness. The inflammation attacked the nerves that carry visual information from the eyes to the brain. They're dying." Dying. The nerves in your daughter's eyes are dying, and there's nothing anyone can do to save them. "Is there any chance the blindness is temporary?" Charles asks, and you can hear the desperation in his voice. The doctor's silence is our answer enough. Then he says, "I've seen a few cases where partial vision returned, but in most cases when the damage is this severe," he doesn't finish the sentence, he doesn't need to. Mary Ingalls, 14 years old, top of her class, the daughter who was going to be a teacher, is blind. Permanently, irrevocably blind. And you, Caroline Ingalls, who has survived everything life has thrown at you, poverty, displacement, infant death, shame, exhaustion, you stand there and you feel something crack inside you that you don't know how to fix. Mary takes the news with a composure that breaks your heart more than screaming would. She's 14 years old, and she's just lost the world she knew, and she sits in her bed, and she nods, and she says, "All right." Just that. All right. Like she's accepting something ordinary instead of something that will shape every moment of the rest of her life. Laura cries. Carrie cries. Grace is too young to understand, but she senses the grief in the house and clings to your skirts, whimpering. You don't cry. You can't. If you start, you're afraid you won't stop. Afraid the grief will split you open and everything inside will spill out and you'll never be able to gather it back together. Instead, you do what you always do. You work, you figure out what needs to be done and you do it. Mary needs to learn to navigate the house without sight. You start teaching her immediately, before she has time to become helpless, before she learns to be dependent. You guide her hand along the walls, teaching her to count steps, to recognize rooms by sound and smell, and the feel of the floorboards under her feet. She needs to learn to dress herself, to braid her own hair, to do the domestic tasks that will be expected of her, even though she can't see. You work with her patiently, showing her how to use touch where she once used sight, how to fold fabric so the seams tell her which side is which, how to feel the heat of the stove to know if it's safe to approach, and she needs education. That's the hardest part, the part that makes you want to rage at the unfairness of a world where a brilliant girl loses her chance at independence because her optic nerves died. In rural Minnesota in 1879, there are no schools for blind children nearby. No resources, no training. Just Mary sitting in darkness, while other girls her age continue their studies. You teach her what you can at home. You read to her, helping her memorize information she can't see written down. Laura helps, reading aloud from textbooks, describing pictures, doing the things Mary's eyes used to do. But it's not enough. You know it's not enough. Mary needs professional education, needs to learn the skills that blind people use to support themselves. Braille. Specialized handicrafts. The kind of training that only specialized institutions provide. There's a school in Iowa, the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton. They take students from neighboring states if families can pay tuition. It's not free, but it's Mary's only chance at the kind of education that will let her support herself, that will give her a future beyond being dependent on family charity for the rest of her life. The tuition is $75 per year, plus transportation, plus supplies. It might as well be $700 because you don't have it. Charles's carpentry work barely covers your family's immediate needs. You have nothing saved, nothing extra. But Mary needs that school, so you'll find a way. You always find a way, even when there isn't one. And that's when Charles hears about the railroad job. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway is laying tracks westward into Dakota Territory. They need men, laborers to lay track, carpenters to build stations, clerks to keep accounts, anyone willing to work hard in rough conditions. The pay is steady, the hours are long, and Charles, who spent the last several years barely scraping by on odd jobs, sees it as salvation. There's another incentive. The railroad is selling land along the route, cheap, to settlers willing to establish farms and towns. This is Charles's pattern. He hears about opportunity and starts planning the move before he's even sure it's real. But this time, you don't fight him on it. Because this time, you need the money. You need steady income that can pay for Mary's education. That can give her the chance she deserves. So when Charles announces that the family is moving to Dakota Territory, that he's accepted a position as timekeeper and clerk for the railroad, you pack the wagon again. It's September 1879. You're 40 years old. You've moved so many times you've lost count. And now you're heading to Dakota Territory, to a place that's barely settled, following railroad tracks into a landscape you've never seen. Mary travels with you, sitting in the wagon, feeling the motion she can't see, listening to descriptions of the landscape passing by. You describe everything to her. The prairie grass, the endless sky, the way the horizon stretches forever. You want her to see through your words, to build a world in her mind that matches the one her eyes can no longer show her. Faintistum disn. You arrive at the railroad camp at Silver Lake in late September. The camp is temporary, tents and rough buildings, men working from dawn to dark, the sound of hammering and sawing and the whistle of the locomotive. Charles's job is to keep time records, to manage the company store, to live in the surveyor's house and keep it maintained while the surveyors are out laying track. The house is small but solid, better than the dugout in Walnut Grove. You make it as comfortable as you can, helping Mary learn the layout, establishing routines that will let her function independently. For a few months, things are almost stable. Charles works, you manage the household. The girls help where they can. Mary practices the skills she'll need for school. You start to believe cautiously that maybe this time will work, that maybe Dakota Territory will be the place where you finally stop running. And then October arrives, and with it, the first blizzard of what will become known as the hard winter. The first blizzard hits in early October 1880, and it's unlike anything you've experienced in all your years on the frontier. You're living in the town of De Smet now, in a small building on Main Street that Charles built hastily before winter set in. The railroad has stopped its westward progress for the season, and the town that's growing along its route is barely a town. A few buildings, a handful of families, supplies that come in by train from the east. The blizzard lasts 3 days. 3 days of wind so strong it sounds like the world is tearing apart, of snow so thick you can't see your hand in front of your face, of cold that seeps through every crack in the walls despite your best efforts to seal them. When it finally stops, the town digs out. You tell yourself it was unusual, a fluke storm, nothing to worry about. The supply train will come through, bringing the flour and coal and other necessities you'll need for winter. Everything will be fine. But the train doesn't come. Another blizzard hits before the tracks can be cleared, and then another, and another. By mid-December, the trains have stopped completely, blocked by snow packed so hard in the cuts that it's more like ice than snow. Snow mixed with earth blown from the bare fields, creating drifts 20 feet deep that no snowplow can move. The town is cut off. No trains means no supplies. No supplies means you're living on whatever food was in town when the blizzard started. And that isn't much because everyone expected regular deliveries. The merchants ration what they have. Families move in together to share heat and resources. You inventory your own supplies with a sinking feeling in your stomach. A few pounds of flour, some potatoes, dried beans, a bit of salt pork. Not enough to last a family of 6 through the winter if the trains don't come soon. Charles and other men try to keep the railroad cut clear, but it's hopeless. Every time they dig out a section, another blizzard fills it in again. The snow falls almost continuously, and when it's not falling, the wind is blowing what's already on the ground into new drifts that bury buildings and make travel impossible. By January, you're rationing food strictly. A small amount of flour for bread each day, potatoes when you have them. Beans stretched as far as they'll go. You feed the children first, giving them the largest portions, then Charles because he needs strength to work, and yourself last, eating whatever's left, swallowing your hunger because acknowledging it makes it worse. Mary sits by the stove grinding wheat in a coffee mill. Someone found wheat that hadn't been shipped out before winter, and families are buying it by the bushel and grinding it by hand because there's no other flour available. The coffee mill makes coarse flour, full of chaff and bits of hull, but it makes bread, and bread means survival. The sound of the grinding becomes the soundtrack of your winter, that and the wind, which never stops, which howls around the building like something alive and angry, searching for ways inside. February is worse than January. You're down to basics now. Wheat ground in the coffee mill, potatoes when you can get them, nothing else. No sugar, no coffee, no salt. You make soup from whatever you have, stretching each ingredient as far as it will go, adding water to make it seem like more. The children are hungry. They don't complain. They've learned that complaining doesn't help. But you can see it in their faces, in the way their clothes hang loose, in how they huddle near the stove for warmth, because you're rationing coal as carefully as food. Mary helps without complaint, grinding wheat by feel, keeping Grace entertained with stories and songs, never mentioning that she's hungry or cold or afraid. Laura helps too, though you can see the restlessness in her, the frustration of being trapped inside with nothing to do but wait. Charles works constantly, trying to keep the house warm, searching for fuel when coal runs low, helping other families dig out after each storm, coming home exhausted and silent. The fiddle stays in its case. There's no energy for music. There's barely energy to keep living. On February 2nd, 1881, another massive blizzard hits. This one lasts 9 days. 9 straight days of whiteout conditions, of snow so constant and thick that you lose track of time, lose sense of whether it's day or night, lose everything except the immediate struggle to stay warm and fed and alive. You're down to almost nothing now. The wheat is running low. The potatoes are gone. You make soup from dried turnips and melted snow, and it tastes like despair, but you eat it anyway because it's all there is. You start to understand, in a way you never have before, that you might actually die here. Not from violence, not from disease, but from simple starvation, from winter that won't end and supplies that ran out weeks ago. You could freeze to death or starve to death in this small building on the Dakota Prairie, and the people in the East wouldn't even know until spring came and the trains finally made it through. But you don't die. None of you die. Because two young men in town, Almanzo Wilder and his brother, make a dangerous journey southeast to a homesteader who might have wheat stored, and they bring back 60 bushels when everyone thought no more wheat existed. Because families share what little they have. Because human beings, when pushed to the edge, sometimes choose cooperation over self-preservation. The blizzards finally stop in late March. The snow begins to melt in April, so fast it causes flooding, 3 days of melt turning the prairie into a temporary sea. The trains start running again in May, bringing supplies that seemed miraculous after months of doing without. You survived the hard winter. Your family survived. But the woman who emerges from that winter is different from the one who entered it. You've been tested in ways you never imagined, pushed to limits you didn't know existed. You've learned that survival isn't dramatic, it's not heroic. It's just grinding wheat by hand day after day, feeding your children one more meal, making it through one more storm. And you've learned something else. You're done moving. Whatever happens next, wherever Charles decides he wants to go, you're staying in De Smet. Because you've found the edge of your endurance. And it's here, in this town that nearly killed you, in this place where you learned that survival is the only story that matters. You're Caroline Ingalls. You've crossed rivers and built homes and buried a son and watched your daughter lose her sight and rationed food through the worst winter anyone can remember. And you're still here, still standing, still breathing. That's enough. It has to be enough. Because you have nothing left to give except the determination to wake up tomorrow and do it all again. Tomorrow comes, and the next day, and the next. And something shifts inside you that you don't have words for yet. It's spring 1881, and the snow is finally melting. The trains are running again. Supplies arrive in De Smet like miracles. Flour that isn't ground by hand. Coffee that tastes like something other than desperation. Sugar that makes you cry the first time you put it in your tea because you'd forgotten sweetness existed. The town begins to rebuild. Families who left during the winter return. New settlers arrive, having heard about land opportunities in Dakota Territory. Buildings go up along Main Street. The church you've been dreaming about finally gets built, and you're there for every meeting, every planning session, every decision about where to put the pews and how to fund the minister's salary. Charles talks about moving, again. He's heard about opportunities farther west, about better land, about places where a man could really make something of himself. The words are familiar, the pattern so well worn you could recite his arguments before he makes them. But this time, you say no, not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly, with a kind of certainty that comes from reaching the absolute limit of what you can endure. You tell him you're staying in De Smet, that your daughters need stability, that Mary needs a permanent home to return to when she comes back from school, that you've moved for the last time. Charles looks at you like he's seeing someone new. Maybe he is. Maybe the woman who stood beside him in Concord, Wisconsin, in 1860, promising to follow him wherever he led, died somewhere between Kansas and Dakota. And the woman standing here now is someone harder, someone who's learned that survival sometimes means saying no. He doesn't argue. Maybe because the hard winter broke something in him too. Maybe because he's finally tired enough to stop running. So maybe because he sees in your face that if he leaves, he'll be leaving alone. So he stays. And for the first time in your marriage, for the first time in 21 years, you stop planning the next move. You stop keeping your belongings organised for easy packing. You stop thinking of home as a temporary word. Mary needs education. The Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, Iowa, is the only institution that can teach her what she needs to know. They teach Braille, music, handicrafts, higher mathematics, literature, all the subjects that will let her support herself, that will give her a life beyond helpless dependency. The Dakota Territory will pay her tuition because they don't have their own school for blind residents yet. In October 1881, the county superintendent certifies that Mary is entitled to the benefits of the Territorial Blind Asylum, and the paperwork goes to the governor. It's official. Mary can attend. But tuition isn't everything. There are books, supplies, transportation to and from Iowa, the small expenses that add up to amounts you don't have. So you find ways. You take in more sewing. Charles works every job he can find. And Laura, your second daughter, does something remarkable. At 15 years old, she takes the teacher's examination and passes. She gets hired to teach at a rural school 12 miles from De Smet, living with a family during the week, coming home on weekends. The pay isn't much, $25 for a 2-month term, but it's money. Money that can help pay for Mary's education, money that can keep the family stable, money earned by a girl who's barely old enough to be called a woman. You watch Laura leave for her teaching position, riding in a sleigh with the man who's hired her to teach his children and others in the district, and you feel pride mixed with something sharper. She shouldn't have to do this. She should be in school herself, finishing her education, being young. But frontier life doesn't care about should. It only cares about survival. Mary leaves for Iowa College for the Blind in November 1881. You pack her trunk carefully, dresses, undergarments, a coat warm enough for Iowa winters, small personal items that might make a dormitory room feel less foreign. She's 16 years old, and she's travelling alone to a place she's never seen, to learn skills she never imagined needing, because a fever 2 years ago destroyed her optic nerves and changed the course of her life. She's scared. You can tell, even though she doesn't say it, even though she squares her shoulders and lifts her chin and acts like this is just another adventure. You hold her at the train station, breathing in the smell of her hair, memorising the feel of her in your arms, and you make yourself let go because holding on would make this harder for both of you. The train pulls away. Mary waves from the window, or at least turns her face in the direction she thinks you're standing, because she can't see you waving back. And you stand on the platform long after the train disappears, and you think about all the things you couldn't protect her from. Illness, blindness, the necessity of being brave when you're terrified. But you got her this far. You kept her alive through fever and grasshoppers and the hard winter, and now she's going to get an education that will let her support herself, that will give her dignity and purpose, and a life beyond the limitations everyone else wants to put on blind people. That has to be enough. You turn around and walk back to the house on Main Street, the house you've decided is permanent, and you start planning how to make it more of a home. Because for the first time in your marriage, you have time to plan, time to build, time to think beyond next season's survival. You're 42 years old, you've been married for 21 years, you've lived in Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, and Dakota Territory. You've built or lived in at least 7 different houses. You've borne 5 children and buried 1. You've survived near starvation and watched your eldest daughter lose her sight. And now, finally, you're going to build a life instead of just surviving one. Mary comes home for summers. The first time in June 1882. You almost don't recognise the young woman who steps off the train. She's different, more confident. She moves with purpose, her cane tapping a rhythm that sounds like certainty instead of hesitation. She's learned to read Braille, to write using a slate and stylus, to navigate using techniques the school taught her. She talks about her classes, literature, mathematics, music, political economy, with an enthusiasm you haven't heard in her voice since before the fever. She's learned to make beautiful beadwork, intricate designs she creates entirely by touch. She makes you a beaded bookmark, and each tiny bead perfectly placed, and when you hold it you think about all the skills she's mastered, all the ways she's refused to let blindness define the limits of her life. She graduates in 1889 after 8 years of study. You attend the graduation ceremony in Vinton, Iowa, travelling by train to watch your daughter receive her diploma. She's 24 years old, educated, capable, and you sit in the audience with tears streaming down your face because this moment is what all those years of struggle were for. Laura is building her own life. She teaches on and off for several years, helping support the family, saving money. And she's being courted by Almanzo Wilder, the young man who risked his life to bring wheat during the hard winter. He's 10 years older than Laura, a homesteader with his own claim. Gear steady and practical in ways that remind you of Charles's better qualities without the restlessness. He calls her Bess, from her middle name Elizabeth, and she calls him Manly, and you watch them together, and you see something you recognise. Two people who've both known hardship, who both understand that survival takes work, who aren't entering marriage with romantic illusions. Laura tells you she won't say obey in her wedding vows. I cannot make a promise that I will not keep, she says, and even if I tried, I do not think I could obey anybody against my better judgment. You look at your second daughter, 18 years old, standing in your kitchen with her chin lifted and her eyes direct, and you feel something like vindication. She's learned from watching you, learned that women can refuse, learned that marriage doesn't have to mean the complete surrender of your will. They marry on August 25th, 1885. The ceremony is small, held in the parsonage of the Reverend Edward Brown. Laura wears a simple dress, black cashmere because it's practical, because it can be worn again, because frontier weddings don't have room for frivolity. Almanzo wears his best suit. You stand there watching them make promises to each other, and you think about the promises you made 25 years ago, and how different your life turned out from what you imagined. But Laura's life might be different. Almanzo's claim is established. He's not chasing horizons. He's building on land he already owns, in a community that's stable, near family who can help when times get hard. Maybe she'll have the life you wanted, a home that stays in one place, Sasti, children who grow up knowing their neighbours, roots that go deep enough to hold. You don't say any of this out loud. You just hug your daughter and whisper, "Be happy," because happiness is the only thing you can wish for that doesn't feel presumptuous. Their early years are hard. Laura gives birth to daughter Rose in December 1886. In 1889, they have a son who dies at 12 days old, never even named. Almanzo gets diphtheria and is left partially paralysed. Their barn burns. Drought destroys their crops. Debt piles up. They struggle in ways that look painfully familiar to you, but they survive. They leave Dakota for a while, trying other places, but eventually they settle in Mansfield, Missouri in 1894. They build a life there, slow, hard, but permanent. Carrie and Grace grow up in De Smet. Carrie becomes a newspaper editor, writing for the De Smet News and other publications. Grace marries a farmer named Nathan Dow and works as a freelance reporter. Neither of them has children. Neither of them moves far from De Smet. You've become a pillar of the community. You're active in the Congregational Church, hosting gatherings, organising events, providing the kind of stable maternal presence the town respects. People know you as Mrs. Ingalls, as Charles's wife, as the mother of those capable Ingalls girls. But you're also just Caroline, a woman in her 50s now, greying and slower, your hands showing the wear of decades of hard labour. You're the woman who survived what shouldn't have been survivable. The woman who kept her family alive through winters that killed other families. The woman who buried a son and watched a daughter lose her sight and moved 7 times in 15 years and never quite broke. You don't talk about the hard years. When people ask about the early days, you give them the sanitised version. Challenges that made you stronger. Hardships that built character. The kind of pioneer mythology that's already forming around the settlement of Dakota Territory. Because the truth is too heavy to share. The truth is that you were terrified most of the time, that you went to bed hungry more nights than you want to count, that you resented Charles's restlessness even while you followed him, that losing Freddie nearly destroyed you, that watching Mary go blind felt like punishment for sins you couldn't name, but you survived. And survival, you've learned, is its own kind of victory, even if nobody writes songs about it. Charles dies on June 8th, 1902. Heart disease, the doctor says. He's 66 years old and you've been married for 42 years, and you stand at his grave in the De Smet Cemetery and you feel complicated things. You loved him. You did. He was charming and good-hearted, and he played the fiddle and made the children laugh. He never hit you or the children, never drank to excess, never abandoned you even when things got impossibly hard. But he also dragged you across half the country chasing dreams that never materialized. He made promises he couldn't keep. He prioritized his restlessness over your need for stability. He made decisions that cost your family dearly. The illegal move to Kansas, the escape from Burr Oak, the constant moving that meant your children grew up without roots. You don't say any of this at his funeral. You say the things widows are supposed to say. You accept condolences. You wear black. You let people tell you what a good man he was, how he helped build the town, how his fiddle music brought joy to so many. And all of it is true. It's just not the whole truth. You live for another 22 years. Mary moves in with you after Charles dies, and you spend your final decades together, mother and eldest daughter, the blind woman and the woman who's watched too much. Grace and Carrie help, visiting regularly, making sure you both have what you need. You die on Easter Sunday, April 20th, 1924. You're 84 years old. You've outlived your husband by 22 years. You've seen the 20th century arrive, bringing automobiles and electricity and a world that would be unrecognizable to the young woman who married Charles Ingalls in 1860. The obituaries call you a pioneer woman. They talk about your strength, your contributions to the community, your role in building De Smet from a railroad camp to a proper town. They mention your daughters, Mary the blind educator, Laura the teacher who married Almanzo Wilder, Carrie the journalist, Grace the farmer's wife. What they don't mention is the cost, the emotional toll of all those moves, the terror of near starvation, the grief of losing Freddie, the helplessness of watching Mary's fever destroy her optic nerves, the shame of leaving Burr Oak in the night, the countless times you swallowed your own needs to feed your children first. They don't mention that you were once a teacher yourself, that you had autonomy and education, and a life beyond being Charles's wife. They don't mention that you spent 20 years following a man whose dreams never quite worked out, that you begged for stability and didn't get it until you were old enough that it barely mattered. You're buried next to Charles in the De Smet cemetery. Your gravestone is simple, dignified, giving your dates and nothing else. And that's fitting somehow, because the real story of your life isn't carved in stone. It's carried in the memories of your daughters, in the skills you taught them, in the example you set of how to survive when survival seems impossible. Mary lives another 4 years after you die. In 1928, at age 63, she has a stroke and dies of pneumonia shortly after. She's buried next to you and Charles, the family reunited in death in a town none of you expected to be permanent. But here's what you don't know, can't know, as you're dying in 1924. Your second daughter, Laura, is going to write about you. She's going to start in the late 1920s, in her 60s, remembering her childhood with the particular mix of nostalgia and selective amnesia that comes with age. She's going to write a manuscript called Pioneer Girl, telling the story of her childhood as autobiography, including some of the harder truths, baby Freddie's death, the saloon in Burr Oak, the fear during the Kansas years. But publishers won't want that version. They'll want something softer, more suitable for children, more aligned with the pioneer mythology America is building about its own past. So Laura, with help from her daughter Rose, will revise. She'll change the point of view. She'll remove the darkest parts. She'll create a character called Ma, who's based on you but isn't quite you. Ma will be calmer than you were, more patient, less complicated. She won't resent Pa's restlessness or fight against his decisions, or struggle with the moral weight of settling on indigenous land. She won't go to bed hungry or cry in private, or feel the crushing pressure of keeping children alive with almost no resources. Ma will be an archetype, the perfect pioneer mother, strong and capable and always supportive, the backbone of the family who never complains, never breaks, never shows the cracks beneath the surface, and millions of readers will love her. We'll hold her up as an example of womanhood, of strength, of the pioneer spirit that supposedly built America. They'll never know about the gaps, the information Laura left out, the complexity she simplified, the way she protected you by hiding the fullest truth of your life. Little House in the Big Woods will be published in 1932, 8 years after you die. The series will go on to sell over 60 million copies. Children will grow up reading about Ma Ingalls, and they'll think they know you. They'll think they understand what your life was like, but they won't know about the shipwreck that killed your father when you were 5, won't know about your education, your teaching career, your independence before marriage, won't know about the complexity of your relationship with Charles, the tension between his dreams and your needs. And you won't know about baby Freddie buried in an unmarked grave in Minnesota, won't know about the full extent of your terror during the hard winter, or your shame after leaving Burr Oak, or the complicated grief you felt when Charles died. They'll know Ma, the character, the myth, the simplified version that fits neatly into children's literature and pioneer mythology, and the story America wants to tell itself about the women who tamed the frontier. But you, Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls, the real woman, you are so much more complicated than that. You were scared and brave and resentful and loving and exhausted and determined, all at the same time. You made choices and had choices made for you. You survived and paid the price of survival. You were strong because you had to be, not because strength came naturally or without cost. And maybe that's the real story, not the sanitized version Laura will write, not the archetype readers will love, but the truth beneath it that survival is messy and complicated and costs more than anyone wants to admit. That pioneer women weren't saints or heroes or archetypes. They were human beings doing impossible things because the alternative was death. You were a woman who lost her father to Lake Michigan, and her son to diarrhea, and her daughter's sight to brain fever. A woman who followed a restless man across 4 states because wives didn't have better options. A woman who ground wheat by hand during the hard winter, and rationed food, and kept her children alive through sheer stubborn determination. You were a woman who finally stopped moving, who finally got the stability you'd begged for, who spent your final decades in one place after spending your youth in constant motion. You were Caroline Ingalls, not Ma, not the myth, just a woman who survived, and that, more than anything Laura will write, more than any pioneer legend, is the truth worth remembering. The story doesn't end with your death in 1924. In some ways, it's only beginning. 6 years after you die, your daughter Laura sits down at a desk in Mansfield, Missouri, and starts writing about you. She's 63 years old, the same age you were when you finally stopped moving, when you stood in dismay and told Charles you weren't leaving again. She's remembering Wisconsin, the big woods, the cabin where she lived from birth until age 7, though she was actually born several miles south of where the published book will place you. Closer to town than the deep wilderness she'll describe. She's remembering Pa's stories by the fireplace, the long winter nights, the maple sugar, the butchering, all the details that make frontier life seem cozy and adventurous instead of terrifying and exhausting. And she's remembering you, Ma, the woman who kept the household running, who cooked and cleaned and sewed and managed everything, who was always calm, always capable, always there. But here's what Laura can't quite remember, can't fully know, what it cost you to be that woman. She was too young. A child's memory is selective, protective. Children remember the maple sugar but not their mother's constant anxiety about whether there will be enough food for winter. They remember Pa's fiddle music, but not the tension between their parents about whether to move again. They remember the cozy cabin, but not their mother lying awake at night, listening to wolves, calculating how many days until the flour runs out. So when Laura writes, she writes what she remembers, and what she remembers is a version of you that's already simplified, already softened by time and distance and the natural process of memory turning complicated reality into digestible story. She calls her manuscript Pioneer Girl. It's an autobiography meant for adult readers, covering her life from Wisconsin through her marriage to Almanzo. She writes it by hand on lined tablets, 350 pages of memories poured out in her 60s, trying to capture what it was like to be a child on the frontier. Some of the harder truths are in there. Baby Freddie dying, the hotel work in Burr Oak next to the saloon, the fear during the Kansas years, the near starvation of the hard winter. These are things that happened, things Laura remembers or learned about later, things that show frontier life wasn't all maple sugar and firelight and Pa's fiddle. She gives the manuscript to her daughter Rose. Rose Wilder Lane, a successful journalist and novelist established in her own career, with connections to New York publishers. Rose has been encouraging her mother to write for years, seeing the commercial potential in Laura's stories, understanding that Americans in 1930, in the depths of the Depression, are hungry for narratives about overcoming hardship, about simpler times, about the pioneer spirit that supposedly made America great. Rose reads her mother's manuscript, and then she starts editing, not just copy editing, not just fixing grammar and punctuation. Rose rewrites large sections, restructures the narrative, makes editorial decisions that will fundamentally change what Laura wrote. She types it up, sends it to publishers through her agent, waits for responses. The responses are rejections, multiple rejections. The manuscript doesn't quite work for publishers. It's too raw, too adult, not shaped right for the market. The Depression has made publishers cautious. They're looking for books that will sell, not experimental memoirs by unknown 63-year-old farm women. So Rose keeps revising. She and Laura work together, though scholars will debate for decades exactly how much Rose contributed, whether she was an editor or a co-author, where the line blurs between helping your mother tell her story and rewriting it into something different. Eventually a publisher gets interested. But not in the full autobiography. In one specific part, the Wisconsin years, Pa's stories, the cozy cabin in the big woods. They want a children's book, not an adult memoir. They want 15,000 words about pioneer childhood, marketed to readers aged 8 to 10. Laura goes back to the manuscript. She pulls out the Wisconsin material, expands it, adds more detail about daily life. Multiple drafts, multiple revisions. Rose edits each one, typing them up, making changes. The point of view changes. Laura's original first-person I becomes third-person Laura. This small shift changes everything. First person is intimate, immediate, subjective. Third person creates distance, turns the narrator into a character, allows the story to feel more universal. Less like one specific girl's experience, and more like an archetypal pioneer childhood. And you, Caroline, you become Ma. Not a name, a role, a function. The mother character who exists in relationship to the children, who's defined by her maternal presence, who doesn't quite get her own interior life on the page. Rose makes other changes too. She moves the cabin location farther north, deeper into the big woods, making the setting more isolated and romantic than it actually was. She adds dramatic elements. She takes a wolf story that actually happened in Kansas and moves it to Wisconsin because it fits better there, creates better atmosphere. She removes darkness, the rawness, the complexity, everything that might disturb young readers or their parents, everything that doesn't fit the narrative of pioneer resilience and family togetherness. What emerges after all these revisions, after all these editorial decisions, is something new. Not quite Laura's memory, not quite your reality, but a story that works. A story that publishers will buy and readers will love, and that will define how generations of Americans understand the frontier. Little House in the Big Woods is published on April 6th, 1932. 8 years after your death. You never see it. Never hold the book in your hands. Never read how your daughter remembered you. Maybe that's a mercy. Here's what didn't make it into the books. Here's what got edited out, sanitized, removed in the transformation from Pioneer Girl to the published Little House series. Baby Freddie, your only son, born in 1875, I died in 1876 at 9 months old. The gap in the published books between On the Banks of Plum Creek and By the Shores of Silver Lake covers this entire period. Freddie's birth, his death, the move to Burr Oak, the return to Walnut Grove. None of it appears. Laura simply skips from age 8 to age 12, and readers never know there was a brother who died, never understand that you buried a child in an unmarked grave in Minnesota. The Saloon Years in Burr Oak, living in the hotel basement, working in an environment where drunk men fought, and children witnessed things children shouldn't witness. Your insistence on moving your family out of there, one of the few times you explicitly refused something Charles wanted to do. It's in Pioneer Girl. It's not in the published books. The illegal squatting in Kansas. The moral complexity of settling on Osage land that hadn't been legally transferred. that still belonged to indigenous people who hadn't consented to your presence, the fear when the Osage returned, the forced removal by government soldiers, the humiliation of being ordered off land you'd invested labour in, land you'd convinced yourself was yours. Laura wrote about this, but the published version glosses over the illegality, makes it seem like simple bad luck instead of settler colonialism in action. Your father's drowning, the foundational trauma that shaped your entire approach to life, that taught you at age 5 that security is an illusion and men don't always come home. That's not in the books. Ma appears fully formed, with no backstory, no explanation for why she's so anxious about safety, so insistent on structure, so desperate for stability. Your teaching career. Before you married Charles, you were a teacher. You had your own income, your own identity beyond wife and mother. You were educated, autonomous, capable. But Ma in the books is only Ma. Her past doesn't exist. She has no life before Pa, no skills beyond domestic ones, no complexity beyond her role in the family, the tension in your marriage, Charles's restlessness versus your need for stability, the arguments you must have had, the times you begged him not to move again, the resentment that built up over years of following a man whose dreams never quite worked out. None of that appears. Pa and Ma in the books are a united front, always in agreement, their relationship presented as ideal pioneer partnership with no conflict, no complexity, no realistic struggle. Your exhaustion, the invisible labour of keeping a household running with almost no resources, the nights you went to bed hungry because you fed your children first, the constant anxiety about food, about money, about survival, the physical toll of bearing 5 children and doing manual labour and never having enough rest. Ma in the books is always capable, never tired, never at her limit. Her strength is presented as natural, effortless, when in reality it was hard-won and came at enormous cost. Your grief, after Freddie died, after Mary went blind, after each move that uprooted your life again. Ma in the books has emotions, but they're always controlled, always appropriate, always contained. She doesn't rage, she doesn't break down, she doesn't show the depth of pain that real mothers feel when facing unbearable losses. Your complexity, the ways you are both strong and scared, both loving and resentful, both capable and overwhelmed. Real Caroline was a full human being with contradictions, with limitations, with a rich interior life we can only guess at because you left no diary, no letters, no direct record of your own voice. But Ma in the books is an archetype, the pioneer mother, strong, patient, selfless, always appropriate, a character, not a person. And maybe that's what readers needed. Maybe in 1932, in the depths of the Depression, Americans needed stories about women who could endure anything, who kept families together through impossible circumstances, who embodied strength without complaint. Maybe the mythology served a purpose, gave people hope, provided models of resilience when resilience was desperately needed. No, but the cost of that mythology was you, the real you, Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls, who was so much more complicated than Ma could ever be. Because here's what happens when we simplify women's stories. We lose the truth of what it costs to survive. We lose the acknowledgement that strength doesn't come naturally, that being the backbone of a family is exhausting, that women who hold everything together are often falling apart inside. We create impossible standards. If Ma could do all this without complaining, without breaking, without showing the strain, then why can't modern women? If pioneer mothers could manage households and bear children and preserve food and sew all the clothing and keep everyone fed and do it all with grace and patience, then what excuse do women today have for feeling overwhelmed? The mythology erases the labour. It makes survival look simple. It takes the most difficult parts, the fear, the grief, the exhaustion, the moral compromises, and either removes them entirely or presents them as character-building challenges that make you stronger instead of traumatic experiences that leave scars. And it means that generations of women have grown up comparing themselves to Ma, wondering why they can't be that calm, that capable, that endlessly patient, feeling like failures when they yell at their children or resent their circumstances or struggle to hold everything together. Because Ma isn't real. Ma is what Laura remembered through the selective lens of childhood, and what Rose shaped through the commercial lens of publishing. Ma is a story about Caroline, not Caroline herself. And the difference matters more than anyone wants to admit. If you could read the books Laura wrote about you, what would you think? Would you recognise yourself in Ma? Would you see the woman you were, anxious, exhausted, grieving, determined, in the calm, capable character who appears on the page? Or would you feel erased? Would you read about Ma's patience and think about all the times you weren't patient, all the times you snapped at your daughters or argued with Charles or cried alone where no one could see? Would you read about Ma's contentment and remember your own desperate longing for stability, for permanence, for a life that didn't require constant moving and constant fear? We can't know. You're gone. Your voice is gone. We only have Laura's memory, filtered through Rose's editing, shaped by publishers' commercial needs, transformed into a story that sold millions of copies and defined American pioneer mythology. But we can ask why the mythology matters so much. Why Ma Ingalls became a cultural icon. Why generations of women have held her up as an ideal of motherhood, of strength, of what women should aspire to be. Part of it is timing. The books were published during the Depression and remained popular through World War II, periods when Americans needed stories about overcoming hardship, about resilience in the face of impossible odds. Ma represented survival without complaint, strength without breaking, the idea that if your ancestors could endure the frontier, you could endure whatever challenges you were facing. Part of it is nostalgia. By the 1930s, the frontier was closed. The pioneer era was ending, and Americans were already romanticizing what they'd lost. The books offered a window into a supposedly simpler time, when families were close and values were clear and hard work guaranteed success. Never mind that none of that was quite true. The mythology felt true, and that was enough. Part of it is gender. Ma became the template for ideal motherhood. Selfless, devoted, always putting family first, never complaining about her own needs or desires. For generations raised on these books, Ma was proof that women could endure anything, that maternal love was infinite, that sacrifice was not just expected but beautiful. But what we lost in creating that mythology was the truth of women's lives on the frontier, the truth that women died in childbirth at alarming rates, that infant mortality meant most mothers buried at least one child, that domestic labour was backbreaking and endless and often dangerous, that women had almost no legal rights, no economic independence, no say in major family decisions like whether to uproot and move again. We lost the truth that strength often comes from lack of options. Caroline didn't endure because she was naturally strong or because she had infinite patience. She endured because the alternative was death. Her own death, her children's death, the collapse of everything she'd worked to build. She was strong because she had to be, not because strength came easily. We lost the truth that survival has costs, that the hard winter didn't just test your family's physical endurance, it left psychological scars. That watching Mary go blind wasn't just a sad chapter in the story, it was a trauma you carried for the rest of your life. That burying Freddie wasn't character building, it broke something inside you that never fully healed. We lost the truth that women's labour was, and is, invisible. The books describe some of your work, but they can't capture the totality of it. The constant vigilance required to keep children alive, the mental load of planning meals and managing resources, the emotional labour of keeping everyone's spirits up when everything was falling apart. That labour disappears in the narrative, taken for granted, presented as something women just naturally do instead of skilled work that requires enormous effort. And we lost the truth that complicated women make better role models than perfect ones. Because real women aren't Ma. Real women get tired. They resent unfairness. They make mistakes. They break down sometimes. They're human, seen with limitations and contradictions and needs of their own. And pretending otherwise, holding up an idealized archetype and saying, "Be like this," sets women up for failure and shame when they inevitably can't meet impossible standards. Here's what I wish Laura had written. That you were scared most of the time. That you loved your children desperately but sometimes felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping them alive. That you loved Charles but also resented his restlessness, his inability to stay satisfied with what you had. That you grieved Freddie for the rest of your life. That watching Mary lose her sight felt like a punishment you didn't deserve. That the hard winter brought you to the edge of your endurance and you barely made it through. I wish she'd written about your teaching career. About the autonomous woman you were before marriage. About the dreams you had to abandon. I wish she'd written about your mother's struggle after your father drowned. About the Potawatomi families who helped you survive. About the complicated web of relationships that made frontier survival possible, instead of presenting it as individual family determination. I wish she'd written about the moral weight of settling on Osage land, about the displacement your family participated in, about the ways your survival came at others' cost. Not to condemn you. You were working within systems you didn't create, but to acknowledge the full truth of what frontier expansion meant. Most of all, I wish she'd written you as a full human being instead of an archetype, because you deserved that. You deserved to be remembered as you were, complicated, flawed, struggling, surviving, not as a simplified ideal that serves a mythology but doesn't honour the reality of your life. The books Laura wrote are beautiful. They're important. They've given comfort and inspiration to millions of readers, but they're not the whole truth. They're a version of the truth shaped by memory and editing and commercial needs, and what's missing matters as much as what's included. Because somewhere beneath Ma, beneath the character, beneath the archetype, beneath the mythology, there's you, Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls, born in 1839 in Wisconsin, died in 1924 in South Dakota. Daughter, teacher, wife, mother of 5. A woman who survived things that should have broken her. A woman who finally stopped moving and built a life in one place. A woman who was so much more than any book could capture. You were real. You were human. You were complicated. And that's the story worth telling. Not the simplified version. Not the mythology. But the truth of a woman's life, with all its difficulty and complexity and cost. Because that truth matters for the women who came after you, who've been measuring themselves against Ma and wondering why they fall short. For the daughters and granddaughters and great-great-granddaughters who deserve to know that strength doesn't mean never struggling, that survival doesn't mean never complaining, that being human doesn't make you weak. You are Caroline Ingalls, not Ma, not the myth. Just a woman who survived. And maybe that's the only truth that really matters. So here we are, more than 100 years after your death, still talking about you, still arguing about you, or still trying to figure out what your story means. In 2018, the American Library Association made a decision that would have bewildered you. They renamed the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, the prestigious children's literature honour that had borne your daughter's name since 1954. It's now called the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The reason? The books Laura wrote contain expressions of stereotypical attitudes inconsistent with core values of inclusiveness, integrity and respect. The racist depictions of indigenous peoples. The line about the only good Indian is a dead Indian spoken by a neighbour in Kansas. The statement that persisted for years. There were no people, only Indians lived there. Some people were furious. They said it was erasing history, punishing an author for accurately depicting her time period, i.e. attacking a beloved American icon. Others said it was overdue, that children's literature shouldn't celebrate works that dehumanize indigenous peoples, that honouring problematic texts causes real harm. But here's what nobody quite knows how to talk about. You weren't the one who wrote those words. Laura did. 60 years after the event she was describing, filtered through childhood memory and adult revision and editorial decisions made for commercial reasons. We don't know what you actually thought about the Osage families whose land you squatted on. We know you were afraid. The fear is documented in Laura's writing. We know you wanted to leave Kansas, that you pushed Charles to return east. But whether your fear came from racist hatred or from being a woman alone with small children in an uncertain situation, whether you saw indigenous peoples as fully human or as threats to remove, whether you ever questioned the morality of your presence on their land. We don't know, because you left no letters, no diary, no record of your own voice. You've been silent for a century, and in that silence, other people have filled in the gaps. Laura filled them with her childhood memories. Rose filled them with her editorial vision. Publishers filled them with commercial needs. And generations of readers have filled them with their own projections, making you a saint or a racist or an ideal or a villain, depending on what they needed you to be. But here's what we do know. You were human. You participated in settler colonialism because that's what the government incentivized, what the culture normalized, what survival sometimes required. You were probably afraid of indigenous peoples you didn't understand, while also being helped by them when your family was starving. You held contradictions because humans always do. And the mythology that erased those contradictions, the simplification that turned you into Ma, always patient, always appropriate, always the ideal pioneer mother, that's done more harm than the original complexity ever could have. Because when we turn complicated women into perfect archetypes, we don't honour them, we erase them. We replace the truth of who they were with a story that serves someone else's purpose. And then we hold up that story as a standard other women can never meet. But what if we did something different? What if we told the whole truth? The complexity, the contradictions, the parts that don't fit neatly into mythology. What if we said, Caroline Ingalls was a real woman who survived impossible things and also participated in an unjust system and was both strong and scared, and her story matters precisely because it's complicated? What would change if we did that? There's a woman somewhere right now who's comparing herself to Ma Ingalls. She's read the books or watched the TV show, and she's absorbed the message. Pioneer women could do everything. They could manage households without running water or electricity. They could bear children without modern medicine. They could preserve food, make clothing, teach children, maintain spotless homes, support their husbands, and do it all without complaining, without breaking, without ever admitting they were overwhelmed. So why can't she? She has a dishwasher and a washing machine and grocery stores with food already prepared. She has indoor plumbing and central heating and hospitals with pain medication. She has every advantage Ma didn't have. And she's exhausted. She's struggling. She's snapping at her children and resenting the invisible labour and wondering why she can't keep it all together when Ma could do so much more with so much less. Here's what she doesn't know. Ma couldn't either. Ma is fiction. The real Caroline went to bed hungry. The real Caroline cried when no one was watching. The real Caroline buried a son and watched a daughter lose her sight and rationed food through a winter that nearly killed her family. The real Caroline struggled and complained and resented and broke and survived anyway. Not because she was naturally strong, but because the alternative was death. But that truth got edited out, removed, sanitized into a mythology that makes survival look effortless, that turns desperate endurance into patient capability, that transforms a woman's trauma into an inspiration for other women to feel inadequate by comparison. The Maya mythology tells women, you should be able to do everything without complaining. You should be strong without support. You should manage invisible labour and call it privilege. You should sacrifice without resentment. You should be calm and patient and capable at all times. And if you're not, something is wrong with you. But the Caroline truth says something different. Survival is hard. Being strong costs something. Women who hold everything together are often falling apart inside. And needing help doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. There's another woman who's trying to understand her own mother. Her mother who worked 2 jobs and raised 3 kids and never complained, at least not where anyone could hear. Her mother who seemed capable of everything, who absorbed every family crisis without breaking, who was always there for everyone else but never seemed to need anything for herself. And now that mother is old or sick or gone, and the daughter is left wondering, who was she really? What did all that strength cost her? What would she have said if someone had given her permission to be honest about the weight she was carrying? She'll never know, because women of that generation learned to be Ma. They learned that complaining makes you ungrateful, that asking for help makes you weak, like that showing the strain means you're failing. They learned to turn survival into service, trauma into strength, exhaustion into capability. They learned to disappear behind the work they did for everyone else. And their daughters and granddaughters are left holding the mythology comparing themselves to women who seemed superhuman, not understanding that those women were human too, just forced to hide it. Here's what changes when we tell the truth about Caroline. We give women permission to be complicated, to be strong and scared, to survive and resent the cost of survival, to love their families and also acknowledge that sacrifice is hard, that invisible labour is exhausting, that being the person everyone depends on is a weight that sometimes feels unbearable. We stop holding up an impossible standard and start honouring the reality of women's lives, the difficulty, the complexity, the ways women hold everything together even when they're breaking apart inside. We say, your struggle is real, your exhaustion is valid, your strength doesn't mean you don't need support, and you don't have to be Ma, perfect, patient, always capable, to be enough. Because Caroline wasn't Ma. Caroline was a woman who survived. And survival doesn't mean you did it perfectly or without complaint or without paying a price. It just means you're still here, still breathing, still doing the impossible work of holding a life together, even when every part of you wants to fall apart. That's the truth. And that truth matters more than any mythology ever could. So to the woman comparing herself to Ma and feeling like she's failing, you're not failing. You're human. And the standard you're measuring yourself against was never real. To the daughter trying to understand her mother's silence, your mother was probably more like Caroline than Ma, strong because she had to be, silent because that's what women were taught, carrying weight she never let you see. To every woman who's been told she should be grateful, should be strong, should be capable of everything without needing anything in return, you don't have to be. The mythology that says you do is a lie designed to keep women serving without support, enduring without complaint, disappearing behind the work they do for everyone else. You're allowed to struggle. You're allowed to need help. You're allowed to be complicated, and contradictory, human, just like Caroline was. If you could speak to us now across more than a century of silence, what would you say? Maybe you'd be surprised that we're still talking about you, that your life became mythology, that your daughter's book sold millions of copies, that children in 2026 are still reading about Ma Ingalls and imagining they know who you were. Maybe you'd be angry about how much got left out, about how Laura removed baby Freddie from the story, erased your teaching career, simplified your relationship with Charles, turned your complexity into an archetype that's haunted women for generations. Or maybe you'd understand. Maybe you'd know that stories are never complete, that memory is selective, that daughters protect their mothers by hiding the hardest truths, that sometimes the mythology serves a purpose even when it's not quite real. But here's what I think you'd want us to know. You weren't special. You weren't superhuman. You weren't naturally patient or endlessly capable or blessed with some inner strength that other women lack. You were just a woman who survived because survival was the only option, who kept going because stopping meant death, who held your family together because no one else was going to do it. You were scared most of the time, scared of starvation, scared of illness, scared of Charles's restlessness dragging you to another place where you'd have to start over, scared when you were pregnant because childbirth could kill you, scared when your children got sick because medicine couldn't save them, and scared that everything you were building would collapse and there would be nothing you could do to stop it. You went to bed hungry more nights than you want to remember. Not dramatically hungry, not starvation most years, but the constant low-level hunger of always feeding everyone else first, of stretching food further than it should go, of training yourself not to notice your own body's needs, because meeting them would mean less for your children. You resented Charles sometimes. Loved him, yes, but also resented his restlessness, his broken promises, his inability to stay satisfied with what you had. You followed him because wives didn't have better options, because refusing would mean destroying your family, because you'd made promises you were determined to keep even when keeping them cost you everything you'd wanted for your life. You cried alone, in the root cellar in the garden, in the moments between tasks when no one was watching. You cried for your father who drowned when you were 5. You cried for Freddie buried in Minnesota. You cried for Mary's lost sight. You cried for the life you'd imagined as a girl, stable, permanent, in one place, and the life you got instead. You weren't always patient with your daughters. You snapped sometimes. You were short-tempered when you were exhausted, which was most days. You felt guilty about it, but you were too tired to change it, and the guilt just became one more weight to carry alongside everything else. You did what you had to do to survive, and sometimes that meant things you weren't proud of. Leaving Burr Oak in the night without paying rent, settling on Osage land that hadn't been legally transferred, making compromises you wished you didn't have to make. You told yourself it was temporary, that things would get better, that you were doing it for your children. And maybe that was true, but the weight of those choices never fully left you. You weren't always fine. The mythology would have us believe you were calm through everything, that you managed every crisis with grace. But you weren't fine after Freddie died. You weren't fine when Mary went blind. You weren't fine during the hard winter, when you didn't know if your family would survive until spring. You just kept moving, kept working, kept breathing, because falling apart wasn't an option. And here's the most important thing. You were enough. Not perfect. Not superhuman. Not the ideal archetype Laura would create. Just enough. You kept your children alive. You created moments of joy in a hard life. You finally stopped moving and built something permanent in De Smet. You survived 84 years in a world that killed women regularly, in a time when childbirth and illness and poverty were constant threats. You were enough, even though you struggled, even though you cried alone and resented your circumstances and weren't always patient or graceful, even though you went to bed hungry and made compromises and participated in systems you didn't fully question, even though you were human, with all the limitations and contradictions that come with being human. You were enough. And that's what you'd want today's women to know, that the standard they're measuring themselves against, the perfect Ma who never struggled, never complained, never showed the strain, isn't real. That you struggled constantly, and that didn't make you weak or ungrateful or inadequate. That survival is its own achievement, and adding a requirement to do it gracefully, patiently, without complaint is a cruelty that serves no one. You'd want them to know that women's work is work, that keeping a household running, raising children, preserving food, making clothing, managing everyone else's emotions and needs, that's labour, hard labour, constant labour, invisible labour that gets taken for granted because it's what women are supposed to do naturally, effortlessly, with joy. But there's nothing natural or effortless about it. And women who do it while also working outside the home, while also managing modern complexity, while also carrying the weight of expectations inherited from mythology, they're doing something impossible and succeeding anyway. You'd want them to ask for help. To refuse the mythology that says needing support makes you weak. To tell the truth about how hard it is, how exhausted they are, how much they're struggling. To stop performing capability and start admitting humanity. You'd want them to know their mothers and grandmothers were probably struggling too, that the silence doesn't mean it was easy, that women learned to hide the weight they carried because showing it was seen as failure, that looking back with compassion instead of judgment might heal something that's been broken for generations. And you'd want them to tell the truth about their own lives, about what it costs to survive, to be strong, to hold everything together, to pass down honesty instead of mythology, complexity instead of archetypes, the full messy reality instead of sanitized inspiration. Because the mythology serves no one. It makes women feel inadequate for being human. It erases the reality of what survival costs. It turns women into archetypes instead of people, functions instead of individuals, myths instead of mothers. But the truth? The truth might actually set us free. So here it is, Caroline. The truth you never got to tell because you left no diary, no letters, no record of your own voice. The truth that got edited out of Laura's books, removed by publishers, sanitized into mythology. You were human, you struggled, you survived. And that's enough. That was always enough. And any woman today who's struggling and surviving and wondering if she's enough, she is. She always was. Just like you. Thank you for watching. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment below. What would you want Caroline to know? What truth are you ready to tell? And remember, you don't have to be Ma. Caroline never was. There's a moment in every woman's life when she decides she's done. When years of saying yes turn into a single, immovable no. When the cost of continuing becomes higher than the cost of refusing. For you, Caroline, that moment came in the spring of 1881, after the hard winter finally ended, after you'd survived months of near starvation and watched your family come within days of death. Charles wanted to move. Again. He'd heard about opportunities farther west, better land, cheaper claims, the same promises he'd made in Wisconsin, in Kansas, in Minnesota, in Iowa. The same restlessness that had driven him for your entire marriage, the pattern he'd inherited from his father and couldn't seem to break. And you said no, not maybe, not let's think about it, not the careful negotiation you'd learned to use after 21 years of marriage, just no, flat, final, the kind of no that carries the weight of every move you'd endured, every home you'd built and left behind, every promise that hadn't worked out. You told him you were staying in De Smet, that Mary needed a permanent home to return to when she came back from school, that your daughters needed stability, that you'd moved for the last time. Oh, and here's what made that moment revolutionary. You won. For 21 years, you'd been the one who followed, who packed the wagon, who made new homes in new places, who swallowed your own needs because wives didn't get to refuse, because marriage meant submission, because you'd made promises on that February day in 1860 that you'd determined to keep no matter what they cost you. But something broke during the hard winter. Or maybe something finally solidified. Maybe watching your family nearly starve to death made you realize that Charles's dreams weren't worth dying for. Maybe grinding wheat by hand for months taught you that survival required permanence, not constant motion. Maybe you simply reached the limit of your endurance and discovered that no was the only word left. Charles didn't leave without you. He could have. Men could do that. Abandon wives, start over somewhere else, disappear into the frontier where questions about your past didn't follow. But he stayed. And you've never known if that was love, or practicality, or exhaustion, or all three. What you do know is that for the first time in your marriage, your need mattered more than his want. Your voice carried more weight than his restlessness. Your no was more powerful than his yes. And that changed everything. You spent the next 21 years in De Smet, building, rooting, becoming part of a community in ways you'd never been able to before. Because before you were always temporary, always planning the next move, always holding yourself apart because attachment made leaving hurt more, but now you could attach. You helped establish the first congregational church and became a deacon's wife. You hosted gatherings, organised community events, provided the kind of stable maternal presence the town respected. You watched your daughters grow into women. Mary educated despite her blindness, Laura teaching and then marrying, Carrie and Grace building lives in De Smet. You took in boarders to earn money. You maintained your garden. You sewed for neighbours. You did the work you'd always done, but now it built something that lasted instead of something you'd abandon at the next move. And when Charles died in 1902, you didn't collapse. You grieved, complicated grief for a complicated marriage, but you didn't fall apart. Because you'd learned long ago that women don't get to fall apart. They just keep going, keep working, keep breathing. Because the alternative is unthinkable. You lived another 22 years without him. Longer than you'd lived with your father before the shipwreck. Long enough to see the new century arrive, bringing automobiles and electricity and a world that would have astonished the young woman who married Charles in 1860. Mary moved in with you after Charles died, and you spent those final decades together, mother and blind daughter. Two women who'd both lost more than anyone should have to lose, finding comfort in each other's presence. And here's what matters about those 22 years. You chose them, not Charles, not circumstance. You. You'd said no to moving, yes to staying, and those decades of permanence were the result of that choice. Your choice. The one you finally got to make after waiting your whole marriage for the right to choose. You died on Easter Sunday, April 20th, 1924, at 84 years old, in the house you'd chosen, in the town you'd refused to leave, surrounded by daughters who'd grown up with the stability you'd finally given them. And they buried you in De Smet Cemetery, next to Charles, in ground you'd claimed as permanent. After a lifetime of temporary stops, you finally had a place that wouldn't change, a grave with your name, a location that would stay fixed while the world moved around it. You'd spent 40 years moving. You spent 44 years staying. And that second number, those decades of permanence, those were the victory. Because you finally chose yourself. Finally said that your needs mattered. Finally stopped following someone else's dreams and started building your own reality. But here's what nobody talks about. What got lost in the mythology. What we need to understand to know who you really were. What did it take to get to that moment? What had to break inside you before you could finally say no? And what kept you in that marriage for 21 years before you found your voice? Behind every strong woman is a story no one tells. Behind every supportive wife is a woman who's made sacrifices so constant they've become invisible. You loved Charles. Let's start there, because it's true. You loved his charm, his fiddle music, his optimism, his genuine belief that the next place would be better. You loved the way he made your daughters laugh, the way he told stories by the fireplace, the way he provided when he could and tried when he couldn't. But love doesn't mean the relationship was easy. Love doesn't mean you didn't pay a price. And love especially doesn't mean the dynamic was equal. Charles made decisions. You implemented them. Charles dreamed. You managed reality. Charles moved the family. You made each new place livable. Charles provided when hunting was good. You stretched resources when it wasn't. Charles played the fiddle. You did everything else. That's not in the books. Laura presented her parents as a partnership, Pa and Ma working together, united in purpose and vision. And maybe that's how it looked to a child. But you were the adult who lived it, and you knew the truth was more complicated. You'd begged him not to move to Kansas. You'd argued, carefully, respectfully, using the tone women had to use to be heard, that the Wisconsin land was working, that Mary and Laura needed stability, that moving was a risk you couldn't afford. He moved anyway, and when the government forced you off Osage land 2 years later, when you returned to Wisconsin with nothing to show for those years, he never apologized. Never acknowledged that you'd been right. You told him the hotel work in Burr Oak was dangerous for your daughters, that living next to a saloon wasn't appropriate, that the environment was wrong. You'd asked to leave. He'd stayed until the money ran out and only then agreed to move, and even then he left in the night without paying rent, making you complicit in something you'd never have chosen. You'd warned him about moving too often, about the impact on your children, about the cost of constant displacement. And he'd promised, over and over, that each move would be the last. Kansas would work out. Minnesota would be permanent. Dakota was the final stop. Promises that meant nothing when the next opportunity arose and the restlessness returned. How many times did you think about leaving? How many nights did you lie awake doing the impossible math of survival? Could you support yourself and 4 daughters without him? Could you return to teaching, even though married women weren't hired? Could you depend on family who'd barely helped before? Could you risk losing your children, since courts always gave fathers custody? The answer was always no. The cage wasn't locked, but every exit led somewhere worse, so you stayed. Not because the marriage was good, but because the alternatives were impossible. And yet when Mary got sick, Charles rode for the doctor. When Freddie died, Charles grieved beside you. When the hard winter nearly killed you all, Charles worked himself to exhaustion trying to keep the family alive. When you finally said no to moving, he stayed instead of leaving without you. That counted for something. Maybe not enough to balance the scales, but something. The marriage survived because you both needed it to survive. Not because it was happy or equal or ideal, but because dissolution meant destruction, and you'd both invested too much to let it collapse. 20 failed homesteads. 20 times Charles tried to make something work and couldn't. 20 times you rebuilt, adapted, started over, made the impossible possible. Most marriages wouldn't survive that. Most wives would have left or broken or turned bitter enough to poison everything around them. But you didn't leave. You didn't break, at least not visibly. And if you were bitter, you kept it private enough that Laura never saw it, never wrote about it, never let it into the mythology. What does that take? What kind of strength? What kind of endurance? What kind of determination does it require to survive 20 failures and keep trying? To follow a man whose dreams never work out and not give up on him? To raise children in chaos and make it feel like stability? The books call it love. The mythology calls it partnership. But maybe the truth is simpler and harder. You survived the marriage the same way you survived everything else, because you had to, because the alternative was worse, because giving up wasn't an option when children depended on you. And maybe that's not romantic. Maybe that doesn't fit the pioneer mythology or the ideal marriage narrative. Maybe it's uncomfortable to acknowledge that strong women often stay in difficult situations not because they want to, but because leaving would cost more than staying. But it's true, and truth matters more than comfort. The marriage survived. You survived it. That's what happened. But here's what the books never ask, what the mythology never explores, what we need to understand to really know what your life cost. What did Charles sacrifice? What did he give up? What did he endure that's equivalent to what you went through? Or was it always you doing the sacrificing, you absorbing the cost? You making the marriage work while he chased dreams that never materialized? And if that's true, if the survival was unequal, if the burden fell heavier on you than on him, what does that tell us about the marriage everyone celebrates as an example of pioneer partnership? We've spent 6 chapters telling your story, Caroline. Your childhood, your survival, your losses, your strength, the mythology that erased your complexity, and the truth that matters more than any legend. But there's another story here, one that's been underneath everything we've discussed, present in every chapter but never fully examined. The marriage, Pa and Ma Ingalls, the partnership everyone assumes was ideal. The couple held up as an example of frontier love, mutual support, shared dreams and shared labour. But was it? You were 20 when you married Charles. He was 24, or maybe 33, depending on which records we trust. You were educated, employed, capable. He was charming, ambitious, restless. You promised to love and honour and obey. He promised to provide and protect and cherish. For 42 years, you both tried to keep those promises. Some days you succeeded, some days you didn't. Most days you did what marriages require. You compromised, adapted, forgave, and kept going. But compromise isn't always equal. Adaptation isn't always fair. Forgiveness isn't always reciprocal. And keeping going can mean very different things depending on which partner is doing it. You compromised by moving 20 times, by abandoning homes you'd made livable, by raising children in constant displacement, by grinding wheat during the hard winter while Charles worked outside, by being the one who had to make each new place work when Charles's latest plan failed. What did Charles compromise? His dreams. But dreams are cheap when someone else pays the cost of making them reality. His comfort. But discomfort is easier when you're the one making decisions instead of following someone else's. You adapted by learning to pack quickly, to make homes in impossible conditions, to preserve food without proper equipment, to bear children without reliable medical care, to bury a son and watch a daughter lose her sight and keep functioning because your other children needed you. What did Charles adapt? He worked different jobs. He tried different locations. But the fundamental pattern stayed the same. He decided where to go, and you made it work. He provided when circumstances allowed, and you managed when they didn't. He pursued independence, and you ensured survival. You forgave the broken promises, the moves that didn't need to happen, the risks that didn't pay off, the times he prioritized his own restlessness over your need for stability, the pattern that repeated for 2 decades before you finally said no. What did Charles forgive? Your occasional snappishness when exhausted, your insistence on church attendance and children's education, your refusal finally to move one more time. The scales don't balance. They never did. And pretending they do, celebrating the marriage as equal partnership, holding it up as an ideal that erases the truth of what you endured. But here's what makes the story worth telling. The marriage survived anyway. 20 homestead failures, multiple states, extreme poverty, infant death, a child's blindness, Near starvation, constant displacement, broken promise after broken promise, and you stayed together. Until Charles died in 1902, 42 years after you married, you were still Mrs. Charles Ingalls, still living in the same house, still maintaining the appearance of the partnership everyone expected. How? Why? What kept you together when everything else was falling apart? That's the question no one asks. That's the story hiding underneath the mythology. That's what we need to understand, to really know who you were and what your life cost. Was it love? Was it necessity? Was it stubbornness? Was it fear of alternatives? Was it religious conviction? Was it concern for your daughters? Was it the slow accumulation of shared history that makes leaving harder than staying, even when staying is difficult? Probably all of it. Probably different things at different times. Probably complicated in ways that can't be reduced to simple answers. But this is the story that needs telling next, not just Caroline's story, not just Charles's story, but the marriage story. The real one, beneath the mythology. The difficult, complicated, unequal partnership that somehow survived what it shouldn't have survived. Because here's what we haven't talked about yet. Charles had his own demons, his own pressures, his own costs, the pattern he inherited from his father, the expectations placed on men to provide, to succeed, to claim land and make it productive, the shame of failure when homesteads didn't work, the weight of trying to feed a family in an economy that was rigged against small farmers. We haven't examined what it cost him to keep trying, keep moving, keep chasing the dream that stayed just out of reach, whether he was driven by optimism or desperation, or fear, or all three, whether he knew he was failing and kept trying anyway, or believed each time that this would finally work, whether he saw the cost to you, or genuinely thought the next move would solve everything. We haven't asked whether his restlessness was selfishness or survival strategy, whether his broken promises were lies or well-intentioned plans that circumstances destroyed, whether he was a bad husband or just a flawed man trying to do an impossible job in impossible conditions, and we haven't examined the full complexity of what held you together, the love that coexisted with resentment, the partnership that was unequal but still functional, the way shared hardship can bond people or break them, and sometimes does both at once. That's the story waiting to be told. The marriage behind the mythology, the real dynamic between Caroline and Charles, stripped of the sanitized version Laura presented and the pioneer ideal everyone wants to believe. Pa and Ma Ingalls. The couple who survived 20 homestead failures. The marriage that lasted through things that should have destroyed it. The partnership that was never quite equal but somehow endured anyway. What was it really like? What kept them together? What nearly broke them apart? How many times did you almost leave Caroline before you finally found your voice? What would Charles say if we could ask him what it cost to be Pa? To live up to the image of the capable frontier father when reality kept proving you couldn't quite manage it? Those are the questions that matter now, the story that needs to be told next. Because knowing your story, Caroline, is only half the truth. To really understand what your life was, what it cost, what it meant, we need to understand the marriage, the partnership, the 42 years you spent as Mrs. Charles Ingalls, making a relationship work that probably shouldn't have, and maybe, just maybe, understanding that marriage, with all its difficulty and complexity and unequal burden, will help us understand something about marriages today, about partnerships that survive despite inequality, about why women stay, about what it costs to make it work when one person is doing most of the work. That's next. That's the story you need to hear. Pa and Ma Ingalls, the marriage that survived 20 homestead failures, coming next. Because Caroline's story is only half the truth, and the other half, it's going to surprise you. Drop a comment. What do you think kept Caroline and Charles together? Love? Necessity? Something else? Let me know what you want me to explore in the marriage video. And if Caroline's story resonated with you, if you needed to hear that survival is enough, if you're tired of measuring yourself against impossible standards, you're not alone. You never were.